you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Energy Institute Statistical Review of World Energy 2023. Now, apparently that's quite difficult to say, so it might become Stats Review as we work through this presentation. So, ladies and gentlemen, the webcast is now live, and we are going globally on this launch today. My name is Juliet Davenport, and I am the President of the Energy Institute. And I want to welcome everybody in the room here today, and also potentially thousands online, which is terribly exciting for us. This is the global launch of what is now the new 70-second statistical review of world energy under new management, i.e. us, the Energy Institute. And for those in the room, we have no fire drill plans. If there is an alarm, it's real. Please exit there. And please, can you put your phones to silent? And if you're online, probably put them to silent as well. So I've been in this sector for about 30 years, and every time I go to an event with this sector, I do get very excited. The energy sector is such a vibrant sector. It's an amazing sector. It underpins sort of our modern society more than any other sector, I think, worldwide. And my journey began in a dusty library. Libraries are always very important things, as we know. In Oxford, when I started reading about a scientific phenomena called global warming. And it was at that point that I started to try and figure out what I should do with the rest of my life. I became an atmospheric physicist. I have to say, not a brilliant one, hence I am no longer an atmospheric physicist. But it started my journey in discovery of looking at what the energy sector meant to global emissions. I actually started on energy and energy security, which is quite timely for potentially our discussion today. But I actually then founded a renewable energy company just over 20 years ago, something called Good Energy, which was really at the forefront of trying to look at sustainable energy here in the UK. At the time, I think renewable energy was about 2% of total power generation. Today, we're closer to 40%, and we'll talk about some of the stats worldwide and what's happening on renewables. And it's really exciting to be the president. I know that sounds a bit weird, but actually this institute has gone on its own journey over time and has now decided to actually work forward towards the energy transition. I have a number of other roles. I do a bit for the Crown Estate, which is, anybody who knows, leases the seabed, which is going to be an important part of our infrastructure related to offshore wind. I also work with an EV infrastructure player, so looking at what our EV infrastructure will look like going forward. And I also work with something called the Energy Ombudsman, which is looking about what energy consumers are going to look like in the future. So for me, everything I do is really about the energy transition, and the Energy Institute for me is at the heart of that. So what is the Energy Institute? It's the chartered professional membership body for people who work across the energy world of energy. And we are in a time of change more than ever before. And what's so exciting about the Statistical Review is it can really help us look at how we're developing and equipping this future workforce. What does it need to look like, and how is it evolving, and providing the actual data that people can see for this transition. I'm hoping that we're going to be, as part of that, we're enabling industry to make energy cleaner, safer, and informing public debates about what is going on. This is why this launch is so important in such an important time, to make sure that we can work forwards in terms of what is going on in energy, what some of the world challenges are. Today, we know that energy emissions are not going in the right direction. And actually, if you start to listen to some of the scientists, they are concerned that we're going towards a 3 to 4 degrees increase in global temperatures. And what this stats review talks about is, what does that look like from an energy point of view, and how are we going to address that? The thing that's really exciting about the stats review is it gives insight in terms of global energy systems and how they are adapting to both geopolitical crises that we're seeing, particularly with the Ukraine war, and to the environmental crises. But for me, what's brilliant about it is that it's full, it's first, and it's free. And that is incredibly important. free data to a worldwide audience means that you have more people working on it. You have more brains trying to figure out the problems and understand the issues. And you have more brains actually trying to find solutions. It's a new chapter in this story for the Stats Review. It's always served as a purpose, way beyond when BP was custodian. I say custodian, obviously they did all the work, but custodian really is what I think the name deserves, because it's so important for policymakers, academics, students, and the industry itself to really understand what is going on in our world of energy. We hope to have a major continuity in this. This data is an important source, and we have done everything we can to make sure it continues and you don't get a disjunct in the data. But obviously, we will be looking in the future to see where this data goes and how it continues to inform not just our members, but global energy players. For me, 2022 is really interesting, and I'm really looking forward to the panel debate about what does this data mean, because you will see, and I'm sure you've all seen some of the headlines. They're really interesting and really exciting, but also slightly depressing in some ways. And we'll get into that. But before we get into the actual numbers, I'm going to hand over to Nick to actually tell us really what's going on. And he will share with you the key elements of the output of this. And then after that, we will come back to a panel where we will discuss this with, I need to say, sorry, I moved to the thanks page. We will sit down and discuss with KPMG, Simon Verley from KPMG. Big thanks to them, and to Carney with Richard Forrest, to talk through what this means to this. Both of them are fellows of the Energy Institute, and they've worked very closely with a team at Heriot-Watt University, also here today, to make sure that this data compilation is complete and reviewed. And then we're going to ask Sarah McFarlane, Chief Energy Transition Correspondent from Thomson Reuters, to host the panel and ask us, I understand, a few difficult questions potentially. But first, Nick is going to go through the outline of this, what this looks like, and then come back. And what I'm going to ask is that people hold their questions until the panel so they can ask Nick questions at that point, and he will just work through this. So thank you very much for being here today for this very exciting launch for us. And I'm going to welcome Nick to the stage.
Well, thank you so much, Juliet, and it's a pleasure to see so many of you in the room today. I'm particularly delighted to see one very young person who's actually got permission to take the day off, or the afternoon off school to join us, which is brilliant to see. Let me just add a few thank yous of my own. I really want to reiterate Juliet's thanks to our partners, KPMG and Carney. The support from the teams has been phenomenal, and we really appreciate it. So thank you, Simon, Richard, and all of your teams. Thank you to Mark and Urkel from Heriot-Watt, who once again have done a brilliant job helping us compile all the data and been with us every step of the way. And of course, the continuing support of BP, Spencer, and Michael in particular. And finally, a huge thank you to my team here at the Energy Institute. We only picked up this statistical review of world energy in February of this year, and the team has done a phenomenal job making it a reality. In particular, I'd like to just briefly thank Ian, Kirsty, Leonardo, Violetta, Jim, Nick, and Neil, and of course the many others who have made this a reality today. I should also say there is a chance I become an uncle for the second time during this presentation, so if I'm slightly distracted at some point, that's because a baby girl hopefully will be delivered safely in Spain at some point in the next couple of hours. So let's quickly remind ourselves of the context for this new set of data. 2022 was another tumultuous year in the world of energy. The Energy Institute coined the term the triple crisis at the start of the year, and that certainly has continued to play out. First, a supply crisis. As we entered 2022, the world was continuing its recovery from the profound impacts of the pandemic, including on demand levels across energy. But overlaid on this, on the 24th of February, was the eruption of the Ukraine conflict. The EU wrestled with decoupling itself from Russian supplies. A succession of steps followed: policies to reduce the use of gas, formal sanctions on Russian oil, efforts to fill storage facilities ahead of winter, the search for new gas supplies, and the acceleration of renewable investments. And probably the only piece of helpful news was the milder winter in Europe, which eased demand somewhat. These events in Europe sent ripples around the world and a resurgence of concerns about the security of energy. We also saw OPEC cutting production during the year and the US government responding with strategic reserve releases. And then the price and economic crisis followed. International gas prices had already begun to escalate as the world came out of COVID in 2021, and supply struggled to keep pace with demand. The Ukraine conflict compounded this on a scale not seen before. We saw record natural gas prices, a threefold increase in Europe, twofold in Asia, and the US hit a 14-year high. The knock-on impacts have been crippling in many consumer economies around the world, beyond gas and into power markets and into many other commodities, including food, driving up inflation and creating the cost of living crisis that we're all now living through, with the subsequent impacts on GDP around the world. And finally, the climate crisis. In the background, the ever-present need to accelerate the transition to net zero by mid-century. As we enter 2022, we've just seen intergovernmental efforts at COP26 in Glasgow fighting to keep 1.5 degrees C alive. The impacts of climate change during this year were all around us. Average global temperatures hit 1.15 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, devastating floods in Pakistan affecting tens of millions of people, and deadly heat events across Europe, North America, and Australia, to name but a few. So this year's data really highlights 5 key stories. Number 1, the post-COVID bounce back. In particular, demand for transportation fuels was the key feature of 2021, and this continued, albeit at a slower pace than last year. The return to pre-COVID levels varied widely between regions and fuel types. Secondly, following the Ukraine conflict, the vulnerability of energy security and affordability came right back into the fore, and unprecedented shifts in the trade flows of gas, oil and coal were required. Number 3, the pace of renewable deployment continued at record pace, driven by solar and wind, equivalent to around 84% of net additions to the power sector. Fourthly, these factors drove an increase in primary energy consumption of around 1%. And whilst renewables reached their highest ever share, the proportion of fossil fuels remains barely dented at 82%. And finally, on emissions from energy grew at about 2/3 the rate of energy growth at about 0.8%. The benefit of record renewable additions was partially offset by the mix of fossil fuel, with increases in coal and oil more than offsetting the declines in gas consumption. Whilst we are clearly not on track for Paris, the intensity of energy emissions is continuing to fall, but with regional variations. I will now talk through each of these in a bit more detail. So whilst the record bounce back we saw in 2021, when oil and refined product demand grew by 6% and 5% respectively, was never going to be matched in 2022, the year did see continued strong global growth in demand for liquid fuels. Globally, oil consumption and refinery throughputs increased by about 3%, taking both to back within 1% of pre-COVID levels. Global oil consumption reached 97.3 million barrels a day. Diesel consumption hit a record high of over 28 million barrels per day, although gasoline still remains about 2% lower than pre-COVID volumes. So the notion of a post-COVID green recovery does not seem to be playing out. As global aviation continued to return to normality, kerosene continued its strong recovery, increasing by 17%. However, it is still some 20% below pre-COVID levels. And according to aviation industry sources, passenger kilometres have roughly doubled versus the lows of 2020, but they still remained about 30% below 2019 levels. Aviation cargo hit an all-time high in 2021, but fell slightly in 2022. As the charts show, the recovery on liquid fuels varies dramatically between regions. Pre-COVID, this tended to be more of an OECD versus non-OECD story, with the latter group of countries driving growth. In 2022, the drivers were much more country-specific and in large part driven by the pace of easing COVID restrictions and then underlying economic growth. The pace of removal of COVID restrictions varied through the course of 2022, with the UK lifting all restrictions on the 24th of February, coincidentally the same day conflict commenced in Ukraine, the US lifting vaccine requirements for travellers in May, but China didn't start lifting restrictions from its zero COVID policy until December. In the US, gasoline demand remained 6% below 2019 levels. Given a full year with minimal COVID restrictions, 2022 was inevitably going to be higher. However, a combination of high pump prices, increased vehicle efficiency and EV penetration have tempered demand from returning to 2019 levels. The EIA has indicated that US gasolines are unlikely to return to pre-COVID levels until at least 2024. A similar picture occurred in the EU, although oil consumption remains some 5% below pre-COVID levels. Developing Asian economies outside of China saw the strongest growth in liquid fuel demand, with India recording around 10% in both diesel and gasoline consumption, and India's oil consumption once again returning above 5 million barrels a day, last seen in 2019. China was the real outlier, as the zero COVID policy had significant impacts on all forms of transportation. Crude refinery throughput and diesel consumption all fell around 4% versus 2021. Gasoline was off 9%, and kerosene fell by about 1/3, sitting at barely a half of where it stood pre-COVID. Without wanting to give a forecast, Chinese domestic aviation has now returned to pre-COVID levels, and international travel has shown a sharp increase since restrictions were eased. So a strong recovery is likely in 2023. Had Chinese demand recovered in line with the rest of the world, it would now sit around 1 million barrels a day higher in terms of crude consumption, which in turn would have taken global crude production to an all-time record of over 98 million barrels per day. The complexities of so many moving parts make it challenging to draw conclusions on the drivers for change in liquid fuel consumption in terms of price, vehicle efficiency and EV penetration, but I'll say a bit more about the overall efficiency storage on energy later. The second and arguably most important theme of 2022 relates to the change in global energy trade flows following the Ukraine conflict. This upended assumptions on energy security and affordability, particularly here in Europe, but with knock-on impacts across the globe. That said, it's worth remembering that record energy demand increases seen in 2021 were already straining supply and impacting price prior to the conflict, with average prices for Brent in January and February of 2022 already 30% higher than they had been for the whole of 2021, and UK gas prices up around 60% comparing the same periods. In 2021, around 37% of the EU's gas consumption came from Russia. Never before, even in the darkest days of the Cold War, had the gas stopped flowing to Europe, but in 2022 it did. It's important to remember that sanctions were not applied to gas. Instead, flow was throttled back. Volumes through Nord Stream 1 fell around 75% from 170 million cubic metres a day to around 40 million cubic metres a day in June, with a further halving in July to around 20 million cubic metres per day before flows completely stopped in August. And just a few weeks later, in late September, both Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 were sabotaged. In total, Russian pipeline exports to the EU and the UK combined fell by over 70 BCM. But remember, these effects happened largely in the second half of the year. And as a minor offset, Russian LNG imports actually increased by about 2 BCM. It can be argued that what happened next is what markets do best. Price signals drove an unprecedented rebalancing of Europe's gas market. Huge shifts in flows of gas took place, with record volumes of LNG arriving from the US and Middle East. In fact, the increase in US volumes met around 60% of the decline in Russian volumes. Pipe gas from Norway also played an important role. Europe also saw record volumes of gas going into storage, around half that shown on the red bar on the right side. And finally, a milder than usual winter, energy efficiency and consumers' response to prices all played a material impact on gas demand. Overall, total EU and UK gas demand fell by over 50 billion cubic metres. The reductions in gas consumption were driven by non-power use, i.e. domestic heating and industrial use. Gas into power actually increased in the EU. exacerbated by the declines in hydro and French and German nuclear. Coal demand did not increase to the extent that some expected, although still increased by 4% in Germany and around 2% across the EU. However, the market was not alone in acting. Governments, and particularly the EU, made rapid interventions in terms of bilateral deals with other governments and the infrastructure to process LNG. Germany saw planning, permitting and operational startup of 2 floating storage and regasification units before the end of 2022, with more expected online by the end of this year. Processes that might have otherwise taken years took place in months. Markets and government interventions may have worked, but at a price. According to the IEA, revenues from EU imports of gas in 2022 more than tripled from $120 to $390 billion. The vast shifts in Europe's gas imports from the US and Middle East and elsewhere unsurprisingly had consequences elsewhere. Whilst the EU's net balance of imports was broadly flat year on year, the higher prices required to achieve this reduced imports to other geographies, notably China, India, and South and Central America. Coal, which we've not charted, was less of a story of trade flows with relatively small changes versus 2021 and more of a domestic story, with coal production increasing to match or exceed consumption, notably in India, Indonesia, and China. One of the biggest falls in domestic gas consumption took place in Russia, on the back of the sharp contraction in the economy where GDP is estimated to have fallen by around 3%. Gas consumption fell by 14%, broadly in line with the reduction in Russia's production. Overall, gas consumption fell by over 3% in 2022. Let me now turn to the trade flows of crude oil and refined products. Last year was more challenging than any other in recent history to track the trade flows of crude and products around the world. So rather than speculate, we'll focus where we have the highest degree of confidence. The story of the rebalancing crude and refined product flow is not as dramatic as the changes in gas. You will recall that sanctions were not put into effect on Russian crude until late in the year when the $60 price cap was implemented. And sanctions on refined products didn't come into effect in the EU until February of this year. So neither was ever likely to make a material impact on 2022. The full story will likely play out this year. However, the chart does indicate the slight fall in Russian crude exports to Europe and a virtual halting of imports by the US. And as European demand for both crude and products increased, as previously described, it was predominantly the Middle East and the US that met incremental demand. As Russian crude exports increase, it has been well documented that crude flows increased to India and China. European imports of refined products actually increased from Russia in 2022, although most incremental demand was met from China, India, the Middle East, and other parts of Asia. Notably, imports from China nearly doubled, albeit from a small base. The third big theme of 2022 is centred around power markets and the continued role of renewables in meeting growth in electrification. Global power demand grew by just over 2% in 2022 to reach a record generation of over 29,000 terawatt hours, 7.5% above 2019, and the near doubling since 2000. However, the 2% growth rate was around half the long-term trend and around half that required to see the expected tripling of power by 2050. Growth in power demand in China, India, and the US was partially offset by falls in Europe, where record high power prices tempered demand. It's worth noting that European power demand has remained broadly flat for nearly 2 decades now. In absolute terms, renewables, excluding hydro, had another record year of additions and have continued a long-term trend of doubling every 5 to 6 years. Once again, the growth was driven by solar growth of 25% and wind of 14%. Growth remains strongest in non-OECD countries, driven in large part by China and India, both of which saw nearly 20% growth in renewable generation. For the first time, China saw over 100 terawatt-hour increase in solar generation, some 30% higher than 2021, whilst India delivered nearly a 40% increase in solar with nearly 30 terawatt-hours of additions. Although hydro grew by about 1% globally, there were sharp falls where it was most needed. In Europe, which experienced a 13% drop, driven by sharp falls in countries such as Norway, Germany, Switzerland, France, and a nearly 40% fall in Spain. a consequence of the record high temperatures and droughts recorded in 2022. This is a clear example of how the impact of changes in weather patterns may impact energy production. Nuclear generation saw a 4% fall globally, driven by the closure of 3 of Germany's nuclear plants at the end of the previous year and maintenance outages in the French nuclear fleet, coupled with slower growth in China at just 2% growth. Renewables, excluding hydro, made up the equivalent of 84% of net power additions. Adding hydro, and this reached over 90%. However, this only tells part of the story. As I mentioned, nuclear declined, and it declined in absolute terms, leaving fossil fuels to contribute around 25% of net additions. Power generation was predominantly driven by renewables, but on a global scale, renewables are not yet eating into fossil generation. In fact, generation from coal and gas both reached record highs in 2022. Let me touch briefly on the resources required to deliver the energy transition. These charts are not intended to be exhaustive, but hopefully give some sense of the pace of growth and the quantum of reserves available. In 2022, both cobalt and lithium saw strong increases in production, each increasing at over 20%. Lithium is now up around 50% since 2019, reflecting the sharp growth in EV production and battery storage. According to the IEA, more than 10 million EVs were sold in 2022, representing around 14% of vehicle sales globally. At the end of 2022, there were around 26 million EVs on the road. The right-hand chart reflects the reserve to production life based on 2022 production levels. If we look at cobalt at the end of 2022, reserves were estimated around 8 million tonnes globally. Around half of this sits in the Democratic Republic of Congo and around a fifth in Australia. Based on 2022 consumption of around 166,000 tonnes, we have approximately 50 years of production. Clearly, the statistic doesn't account for increasing production in future years, nor the discovery of new reserves. I won't get into the forecasting game, but for now, the constraint is more on accessing resources such as cobalt to meet today's demand, and the challenges around doing that ethically and environmentally rather than the quantum of reserves available. So how did the dramatic impacts of 2022 play out in the global mix of primary energy? Well, surprisingly, or perhaps unsurprisingly, there was very little change in the overall mix, as primary energy demand rose by just over 1%. And for the sixth consecutive year, coal remained at 27% of primary energy, returning to its 24 peak production and reaching a record high in production terms as storage volumes built up. Oil's share increased slightly to 32%, but global production of around 97 million barrels a day remains slightly below the 2019 peak. And gas lost market share from 25 to 23%, driven by the fall in global consumption. Putting coal, oil and gas together represents just below 82% of primary energy, 2% below 2019 levels. And had China exited its zero-COVID policy earlier, the picture would likely have seen the mix of fossils actually increasing year on year. Renewable share increased from 6.7%, reaching 7.5%, excluding hydro, driven, as I mentioned before, by wind and solar in roughly equal measures, and biofuels and other forms adding a much smaller proportion. Adding in hydro, and the share reached over 14%. Looking at the trends of primary energy split across 4 key regions highlights that inevitably the energy transition will occur in different ways and at different paces across the world. And these charts just show the split by primary share cumulative to 100%. And in the US, it's clear to see the decline in coal, down nearly 7% last year alone and nearly halving since 2012. Gas and renewables have more than filled the gap, gas increasing from 27 to 33% and renewables increasing from 4 to 9% share. Oil has remained consistent in market share terms, 38% in 2012 and 38% in 2022. The EU has seen a doubling of renewable market share to 15%, whilst coal fell from 17% to 12% over the last decade. Gas was broadly flat from 2012 to 2022 at 21%. And like the US, oil has remained broadly flat. China has perhaps the most interesting story. Despite significant absolute growth, coal's market share has fallen from nearly 70% to around 55% today. Oil has maintained relatively flat market share around 17 to 18%, with renewables and gas growing from 1% and 4% respectively to each having 8% in 2022. And finally in India, where apart from renewables growing from 2 to 6%, coal, oil and gas have remained remarkably stable in market share terms over the last decade, despite the growth in absolute energy. This chart shows the energy intensity of key global economies, simply how many megajoules an economy expends for each dollar of GDP. I was going to do a quick poll and ask if anybody knew what 1 megajoule of energy actually did, but I won't embarrass you. But I'll just let you know that a 1 megajoule is roughly equivalent to boiling around 3 1-litre kettles. You could drive an electric vehicle for about 1 mile, or it's the equivalent of about 30 millilitres of gasoline, which doesn't sound very much, and that would move a typical car about 1/3 of a mile. Whilst the world continued to disconnect its economic growth from energy consumption, 2022 showed some significant variations. Given the number of moving parts, some caution should be exercised in drawing too many long-term conclusions, however. The EU reduced energy demand by about 3.5%, whilst GDP grew by about 3.5%. This was driven predominantly by reductions in non-power related gas, as people simply did not heat their homes to the same extent, and some heavy industries reduced output. Conversely, the US saw energy demand growing somewhat faster than GDP, nearly 3% versus 2% GDP. This looks to have been primarily driven by the demand in transportation fuels returning to pre-COVID levels, although it's worth noting that US energy intensity is nearly 5% below 2019 levels. What is challenging in all of this is isolating the impacts of the return of normal activity versus price signals tempering demand versus energy efficiency, and that will be something we'll try to look at in more detail in next year's report. But what is clear is that consumers' focus on energy efficiency has returned in a way that was absent for much of recent history. Gasoline at £2 a litre in the UK and over $4 a gallon in the US has focused consumer choices around transportation. Similarly, an approximate tripling of domestic gas and electricity prices in parts of Europe has focused consumers on how they consume energy. So putting the whole story together in terms of what happened to emissions in 2022, emissions from global energy increased by about 0.8%, reaching an all-time high of 39 billion tonnes CO2 equivalent. Clearly, emissions are not moving in the right direction to meet the Paris Agreement. However, the story is somewhat more nuanced. Whilst renewables made a record contribution, it was the mix in fossil fuels that led to higher energy intensity in fossil energy. Effectively, the fall in emissions from gas were more than offset by the combined increases from oil and coal production. And the yellow line there just shows the sort of year-on-year changes. So not quite the massive 6% increase that we saw in 2021, but still moving in the wrong direction. This picture comes a little bit clearer when we look on a regional basis. Whilst absolute emissions increased in the US, the emissions intensity of energy consumption fell, largely driven by a 6% fall in coal use. So whilst emissions have gone up in the US, the units of emissions per unit of energy have decreased. India saw both higher absolute emissions and intensity as gas consumption declined, but both oil and coal increased. And whilst India's emissions are the highest on the chart, it is of course important to mention that on a per capita basis, they are nearly 1/8 of those of the US and 2.5 times lower than the world average. And although the EU saw an overall fall in emissions of nearly 0.7%, energy consumption decline fell faster, about 5 times, leading to the relative uptick in intensity. So quite a complex picture there. And you can see the gap between the US and the EU has narrowed, although clearly this could change as markets rebalance this year. And in China, the continued fall in liquid fuels demand reduced emissions even as overall demand increased. However, the inevitable post-COVID demand growth is likely to reverse this in 2023. And finally, not on the chart, volumes of flared gas and methane emissions fell. A step in the right direction, but still a massive issue that needs addressing. Putting it in context, global gas flared was about twice of Germany's consumption last year. So bringing the presentation to a conclusion, in a year when energy returned to the front pages for all the wrong reasons, both a lot happened and not that much happened. First, the world continued its trajectory back to pre-COVID trends. Outside of China, most geographies and most energy sources are close to their pre-COVID levels. This drove another strong increase in global oil demand, taking us above 97 million barrels a day and within 1% of the all-time high of 2019. China will almost certainly see a reversion of this in this year, particularly in respect of aviation. And as I mentioned, had China's demand returned in line with the rest of the world, global oil consumption would likely have hit an all-time record. The prospect of the green recovery has not played out thus far. Second, the Ukraine conflict resulted in unprecedented changes in the trade flows of energy. Governments and markets intervened to rebalance supply and demand, notably in Europe, but with impacts felt across the world. And a record financial cost to Europe with consequences on the import mix for other regions. Third, we saw record additions of renewable energy in absolute terms. All of this played into the global energy mix that saw a record amount of renewables in primary energy with 7.5% or 14% including hydro. But coal, oil and gas remain firm at around 82% on a global level. And finally, emissions have continued to rise. The shifts in coal, oil and coal flows created regional differences, but the macro trend of disconnecting the rate of emission from energy does continue, albeit slowly. So what does all this mean for the energy transition? Is the energy transition happening? The answer is probably a bit of yes and a bit of no. Yes in terms of the renewable growth, but a clear no in terms of the reduction in demand for fossil fuels. Are emissions moving in the right direction? Clearly not. Are there some reasons for optimism? Yes. Record renewables, the intensity of energy continues to fall, and flaring and methane emissions also continue to fall, but not fast enough. And did energy markets work in rebalancing supply and demand? Yes, but, and it was a very big but, at an unprecedented cost to energy consumers around the world. With that, I'll draw this presentation to a close, and I'll invite our panellists to join me up on stage and hand over to Sarah.
Thanks very much for that, Nick. Very informative presentation. Let me introduce everyone that's going to be on the panel with us this afternoon, starting with Richard Forrest, Global Sustainability Lead Partner and Chair of the Energy Transition Institute at Carney. Then we have Simon Burley. Simon is Vice Chair and Head of Energy and Natural Resources at KPMG in the UK. And then obviously we have Juliet, who you've all met this afternoon, and Nick. I thought that we could encourage you all to be thinking about questions from the get-go, and that includes everyone who is watching this online. We'll have a roving microphone, so just raise your hand if you have a question. And for those online, you can type your questions in, and I have an iPad ready to take them. I thought we could start initially by asking each of our panellists to say a little bit about themselves and what their initial takeaways are from the report today. So if we start with you, Richard.
Fantastic. Well, first of all, I'd just like to say thank you to Nick and Juliet and the entire Energy Institute team. It's been a pleasure teaming up, and with Simon and the KPMG team. It's been a whirlwind of 3 months, we would say, but we're very pleased to be here today and very pleased to be now part of the custodians taking over the great job that BP have done for 70 years going forwards. Maybe to build on Nick's opening comments there, I mean, as we looked at that, the takeaway from 2022, I mean, wow, what a year of, for all the wrong reasons. The Ukraine conflict created a set of dynamics in the energy system that, required a significant response. And I think the takeaway was, energy security, affordability, and clean energy, all three are very important. And security came to be number one in 2022 early on. And that created a response and a pace of change that was quite remarkable in a way. And when we think about the level of oil and gas trade flows shift, we had coal filling in various places as well. And I think that shift in Europe also created and reminded us that there is a wider connected energy system here. So it wasn't just Europe, this connected to other parts of the world from an affordability point of view as much as anything else. I think that shift also demonstrated a level of pace of change, which we might say could be something that the energy transition needs as well. I mean, when we saw Germany with the floating regasification unit going up in 10 months, that was quite a phenomenal set of changes, both from giving the authority and also getting that done. And maybe then, if we reflect then on the emissions side, 1% increase in primary energy associated with a 0.8 on the emissions, clearly, as Nick said, going in the wrong direction. And in particular, with China not being fully back, with aviation not being fully back, with a general trend that we're starting to see the pre-COVID levels now come back in all those areas. I mean, the big open question was, is energy transition still going in the right direction? And, I mean, on reflection, broader than the data that you'll see in the statistical review and when we do our work in this area, I would say directionally, we're still on the same path. Pace-wise, way too slow for any of the targets that we've achieved. I think the positives that I take away are the level of build-out on renewables has been larger than ever. Continues that doubling every 5-6 years or so. And also in places like China, China, of that 90% that was put down in terms of filling the 90% of the energy requirements, I think China made up 40% of that, 37% on solar and about 41% on wind, which was good to see with all the other data around that. I think also the shift on aviation last year, we've now got SAF being clearly early days, but clearly being a direction of travel with 38 countries signing policies associated with that and all of the other topics associated with that. Electric vehicles, massive increase in electric vehicles last year. Of course, we need to be careful where the electron comes from and is it a clean electron, but energy transition is not a straight path. It will be messy. It will continue to be messy. We've got to deploy a lot of capital quickly. We've got to build supply chains quickly. So to some extent, all of these changes, I think, were positive. Final point I would make is a few things to consider. One is on all of that build out of the energy transition. When we looked at is this going in the right direction? The systems element of this. These are all interconnected. We put renewables in. We need storage. We put storage in. We think about the EVs. We think about other molecules, biofuels, hydrogen, etc., all early stages. But there's a lot of interrelationships between the two. And there was a couple of things which stood out as headwinds that we believe are still fundamental. One is the supply chains associated with delivering that level of growth, pretty fundamental. So if we looked at wind, solar, some of the grid infrastructure, even like basic transformers, they were all squeezed at different points last year, and that will continue to be the case. So we need to, if we want to adapt that pace of change, bring those into play much more quickly. I think the final point I would make is something we started to see towards the end of last year, which also gave another push on the pace, was that the Inflation Reduction Act brought in by the US was clearly a signal of intent that this is an energy transition, but it's also an economic transition. And that economic transition is something that many regions will clearly want to participate in. We had a response from the EU. We've had China already significantly engaged in solar, in electric vehicles and other elements of this. So you've got major economies now putting real money and real pace behind the build-out of those technologies, those supply chains at scale. I'm very excited to see what that means for 23. But as Nick alluded to, first half of this year, we're seeing some of the old trends continue. So it will be a balancing act.
Thank you. Simon?
Yeah, very much agree with that, Richard. And firstly, let me just say how proud we are to be associated with the Statistical Review of World Energy. Delighted it's in safe hands with the Energy Institute, and great to be involved. For me, I'll boil it down to a simple ABC. The A is for the acceleration of renewables, that standout figure that Nick mentioned, the 84% of the increase in generation that came from renewables. We see it every day in our work around the world. Renewables are commercially viable without subsidy in pretty much every part of the world. Not all renewables, but many are. And you just see that in the data. So you see 19% year-on-year growth in China. In India, it's 19%. In America, it's 16%. In the Middle East, it's 20%. So the pattern's pretty consistent around the world. The B, though, my B is the but, and that's that 82% figure. The fact that we are still stuck, despite that growth, at 82%. And if you look back at that data series, going back 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, we've only come down a few percentage points. And then my C is the sort of long COVID effects you see in the data from China's very, late opening up of their economy. So, full restrictions on travel only lifted in January of this year. So, you're seeing that in the jet kerosene data that you mentioned, Nick, in terms of, 78% of the pre-COVID peak. So, we haven't yet seen the effects on this data of the Chinese economy at full bore, and one would expect that to unfold in 2023.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Juliette?
So a lot already said, and can't disagree with anything that's already been talked about. But for me, what I think is quite interesting is the whole issue around security of supply. And the fact that this has now become the core driver of energy policy, particularly in Western Europe, but has been a forgotten tool to a certain extent for the last 10, 20 years. And for me, what's interesting about it, what I worry about is the knock-on impact, is that we've seen a lot of things move at pace to respond to the security issue. But actually, are we laying down something that's going to carry on sort of undermining the transition to a certain extent? Because we've made a very fast move to try and deal with the gap that Russia has left. And what does that actually look like going forwards? I think for me also, renewables is a great story. Slightly disappointing that we can't see more renewables in Africa. That's probably the lowest rate of change in terms of investment. And so question would be, is there more as sort of worldwide that we should be thinking about how we deploy renewables at pace in Africa? And I think the demand side is disappointing. I mean, I think obviously sort of there's some big figures up there from the Middle East, America as well, the US. And it's interesting because ERA obviously is a really important policy mechanism going forwards, but it does feel that the US is slightly behind at the moment and needs to catch up. So although China is sort of revving up, the question is if America starts to rev up, particularly on its investment in renewables and clean tech, could we see that come through? So I'm quite excited, one, to be taking this over as an institute, but also then to see what's going to happen in the next couple of years, because that's when we really begin to see what's going to be going on in this data.
Thank you. Nick, I was going to skip over you because you've just had to speak for 45 minutes, but if you do have any comments.
I think the only, what we can't unpick from the data, and I'd love to get into, is around sort of energy efficiency. How much of Europe's decline was because people were colder, because they were wearing thicker jumpers, versus changes to how we are heating and cooling our homes, changes in transportation. You would have picked up when I mentioned how far 1 megajoule gets you. It gets you about 1 mile in an EV. The same 1 megajoule gets you about a third of a mile in an internal combustion engine, roughly. And so I think there's a big energy efficiency story that will roll out over time. I think the question is how much does price attenuate the focus on demand? And we've lived in a world for much of the past several decades where actually people didn't pay attention to for the most part, didn't pay attention to their gas bills, their electricity bills. It just came, they never checked it. Whereas we all now put a lot more focus on that. If prices come down as they are slowly, do we go back to increasing demand, or does efficiency catch up? And I think that's one of the things that we'll look forward to trying to unpick. But I think there are reasons for optimism. I also think there are reasons for pessimism around that, particularly the sharp pickup in terms of the liquid transportation fuels I talked about.
One of the things that struck me, and I'm going to pick on you first, Julian, was that we've got record deployment of solar and wind, and yet fossil fuels remain 82%, remain steady as part of the energy mix. And I kind of wonder, well, what's it going to take? Why is it that they are so sticky? Is it that more and more coal and gas power plants are being built? Is it that the ones that are already built are being extended? Their lifetimes are going on for longer than anyone anticipated, especially when you think, well, renewables are the cheapest option in many places today. it's surprising to see that they're not really denting fossil fuels.
So I think there's a couple of things going on in here. If we start with the renewables part and sort of the pace of renewables, one of the biggest challenges for renewables that renewables is now becoming to look at is the infrastructure. So the infrastructure, particularly the power infrastructure, was built in a high carbon world where, I mean, the UK infrastructure was, 30 power stations sort of 30 years ago, and now we're over 1 million. So suddenly you're taking a power infrastructure that was built for a completely different world and asking it to take in completely different feeds from power. And I know that Europe is struggling in terms of what's this next pace going to look like? How long is it going to take us to connect? Significance of potential of offshore wind, particularly in the UK and in Northern Europe. But then if you look at the Asia Pacific countries as well, big challenges with grid and getting access to grid, partially not just because of the grids themselves, but also because of the legislation and the regulation around those grids, and actually how do companies interact. I then think the other part that we have to look at is how fossil is looking on balance sheets at the moment. So one of the big challenges is going to be is if you've got power stations or fossil assets that have a life cycle beyond the energy transition, how are we actually looking at that from an audit point of view? My understanding, and maybe it's very layman-wise, but that's what I remember from running a company, is as soon as you know that an asset doesn't have a value, you have to write it off. And that is a massive challenge. There's no nice curve. If assets begin to not have a value going forwards, then they have to be written off immediately. And that has massive implications for the pension industry as well, where we've got massive infrastructure investment. So it's how do we do it from an audit and accounting point of view? Maybe I should ask KPMG this question going forwards, because this is every chief exec of an energy company is not going to be wanting to be the one to put their hands up and say, I don't think this asset will have a future value beyond the next 10 years.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Simon?
Well, I think Juliet's right. The way that companies account for this stuff is going to become increasingly important, and there are a whole swathe of new regulation coming in terms of climate risk reporting and so on, which is starting actually, I think, to bear in terms of, the rate that banks will lend at, the availability of insurance, the cost of that insurance, etc. So I do think that corporate reporting side is an important part of this mix. It's not the subject of today, of course, but it is actually an important part of the mix.
Anyone else have any points on that?
My only add to that would be just thinking about those assets. I fully agree with you. We either have to put a write-off or we have to find a new use. I would say there is a lot of energy and activity going around about how do existing energy system infrastructure assets play a role going forwards, and what is the reuse case. And if we have to deploy all of that capital again, it's just going to take longer. Equally, some of the reuse cases, they need to be biased towards the future, not holding on to the past. And I think that balancing act across the different energy vectors we're just starting to see play out in coal, oil and gas assets, infrastructure assets, etc. I think it's terribly important that we make use of it, and we should play those in, but just in the right way.
I just wanted to come back to you, Nick, on the point that you were making about efficiency. Obviously, last year there were a lot of efforts made in Europe to try and increase energy efficiency after Russia invaded Ukraine. But is that borne out in the numbers at all? Because I see that the energy used per person globally went up slightly, was in line with the sort of long-term trend. Was there anything in the data that showed that there were some efforts to try and increase energy efficiency?
I think it's really hard to pick out one thing from another. So you've got price, you've got energy efficiency, you've got the fact that you didn't have supply in some instances. I think the one proof point that says that there was a reaction was Europe's decline in energy, which was down 3.5%. So that is significant. I think from the data we separate out gas into power and gas into other uses, which effectively would be heating and industrial use. We can't break it out beyond that in a very helpful way. But if you look at that, gas into power went up, gas into other forms went down, and we know that industries were shutting down or reducing throughput. We know that people were heating their houses less, particularly in Germany. And so I think there are some indications there, but I would assert that wearing a thicker jumper in a cool home is not really delivering energy efficiency. That's just responding to the crisis that you're in at that point in time. So I think this does really emphasize the need for a far greater focus on energy efficiency. We have an incredibly inefficient energy system globally. We have grown up with energy being so widely available to us in the Western world, not in the developing world so much, that energy has not been used efficiently. And one of the things the Energy Institute does a lot of is training and developing people who work in that space. We launched a platform called Energy Aware last year on Martin Lewis's website, which helps consumers reduce energy. So there's a lot more of a prize, but we're not going to deliver those changes overnight.
I think that begs the question, was last year a missed opportunity? Did governments really do enough to try and accelerate the transition? Because when we look at the data, it's not accelerating at the pace that many governments had hoped.
I personally think it was. I mean, I think what we saw was governments step in with financial packages. And interestingly, we're now getting something similar to the mortgage response and the cost of living here in the UK. The investment in energy efficiency is an upfront cost. It's not something that and it takes a while to do, and it's also quite complex.
It's a long payback.
Yeah, well, sometimes it's not that long, but it's longer than it doesn't deal with the immediate cost of living crisis. And I think governments have to rethink how they're looking at this. Particularly, the cost of money has just gone up. So with an upfront investment like this, how are we going to deal with that? And actually, you could this whole question around how you manage inflation going forwards. I think the energy question plays into that big time.
Is it anyone? Yeah.
And if you think about what would be needed for the world to be on track for Paris, you would have needed to have seen that drop we saw in energy demand in 2020 repeated year after year after year in order to be on track for Paris. Clearly, we are not on that trajectory at the moment. That's clearly, in some senses, a missed opportunity. But it'll be interesting to see in the data. I mentioned the jet fuel data that Nick mentioned, gasoline demand being still below peak. Is there anything in there about behavioural shifts? Is the world changing its pattern of work, or are we going to just see that bounce back as we see the full effects of China reopening all its borders this year? That's one to watch, I think, in the data that we get over the course of this year.
Mm-hmm. Richard, I wanted to ask you about if we were to look at the data on a regional basis. Obviously, it's a little bit bleak in terms of the transition if we're still at 82% fossil fuels, and the idea is that number should be coming down. Were there any places that were bright spots? Are there places that are showing that this can be done, that there is an acceleration happening in specific locations?
Yeah. Well, maybe, I mean, there's some historical bright spots. Like if you always go to Brazil, it's got natural resources, etc. It's got a huge area. Norway, somewhat similar. So there's always been those bright spots. But if we look specifically through 22 and maybe the year before as well, post-COVID, I would say that, and it might be a little bit counterintuitive, but the scale of build out that we're seeing in some of the India and China in particular. You might not call it a bright spot for the reasons, but on that renewable build-out, that's a significant commitment and a significant push in the right direction. And you saw the coal number come down from the primary energy use that Nick presented. If you come back to maybe Europe, obviously, I think Europe had security as a top priority, but yet continued to push out. And I think the redoubling down in Europe of policy associated with acceleration, whether you say it's in response to clean or whether it's in response to the Ukraine conflict, I think the Ukraine conflict certainly sharpened the attention on energy security, affordability and clean coming together in one go. And we saw some of the policy and push there. And then, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, a bit like Julia, I'm looking forward to seeing how some of the changes in the US are going to come through this year in response. Certainly from a business community point of view, we're seeing a lot of interest in what does this mean for my investments, what does it mean for my location of investment, what does it mean for my pace of investment, and how do I manage into what is a huge market with good support from the government to get that done. And the US was already on a track in a direction, but it certainly wasn't to the scale of what we just saw at the end of last year.
What about China? What would you take away from the data on?
Well, I mean, China, two things on that, and one is the renewables I just mentioned. The electric vehicle is the other. The conversation on the electric vehicle is always, well, there's a lot of coal electrons sitting around in China. I don't think there's a direct straight line linear sequence of events that any country is going to go through in shifting its energy transition. I do think there's a lot of capital that needs to be deployed and deployed well, and supply chains need to respond to that. So, I think those changes I still see as very positive as China, as again, a huge region, makes that change. I think India is another one to watch. Somewhat different in terms of its makeup and the way that things will roll out there, and it starts at a very different point to where China is today. It has some similar challenges and direction.
Just to build on that, and we see it every day in our business at KPMG, is the gravitational pull of the Inflation Reduction Act in terms of activity and investment. So that won't really have come through in the 22 data, but I suspect it will come through in the 23 data. And on Europe, you've got this reduction in energy demand, which in some senses is good news, but also you've got coal demand going up, which is clearly an energy security story. But of course, as fossil fuels become more expensive, you've then got that increased attraction of investing in renewables. So we see renewables moving ahead. So there is a slightly difference between a short-term impact and then the longer-term impact of the crisis, I think, that we'll need to unpick.
If I just stay with you for a second, Simon, I wanted to ask about, Nick mentioned that nuclear electricity generation was down, and although hydro was up in total, there were places where it was down by a lot, particularly in Europe. I think Nick mentioned the figures were quite stark. And given these are low emissions possibilities for generation, I just wondered how concerning that is and what that means. I know we're not talking about the future, but what you would take away from 2022's data on nuclear and hydro in particular?
Well, we're starting to see the effects of the climate change that's already in the system on energy production, aren't we? I mean, that's, I think, one of the clear takeaways I would draw out from the 2022 results. And of course, that's only going to increase given the global warming that's already in the system. So I think hydro is a case in point from the drought last summer in Europe, and we see those numbers much lower than you would have expected. And that means I think we all need to be thinking about the resilience of our energy system, physical resilience, where are we putting energy infrastructure and diversification so we're not overly dependent on one source of energy. So I think resilience is just going to become an even bigger topic, I think, over the next few years.
Did you have anything to add on that, Nick?
I mean, I think the numbers speak for themselves. We're not going to sort of forecast what impacts will play out in hydro. I think nuclear is really interesting. The timing of the German shutdowns really could not have been worse. And the question is can it be delivered at the scale, the pace, and the cost it needs to be to play a significant role? And there are some very different views out there on how likely that is.
I'm going to pause for a second, even though I have endless questions, and give everyone an opportunity to ask. I also ask that if you do have a question, please can you introduce yourself and also let us know where you work, in what field in energy. I also have questions online, but I might start with the room. If we could have the microphone here, please.
Hi, thank you very much to the panel and to Nick and the team at the Energy Institute. It's wonderful to see all the data and get the insights on the first day. My name's Sarah George from the World Resources Institute, and I had a question. I've heard some talk about how the price shocks in 2022 gave a little bit of potentially a preview as to what might happen if a sufficiently strong carbon price was brought in. Obviously, it wouldn't be brought in quite so suddenly as what we experienced last year. But I wonder if the panel has any thoughts about any lessons or insights that we can extrapolate from what happened last year in designing a carbon price for the future.
Thank you. Does anyone want to volunteer on a carbon price question?
I mean, I can start with, what's interesting is the barriers to deployment at pace. So if you look at, so renewables we know are commercial already. You don't need a carbon price to bring in to basically make solar or wind more cost effective. The biggest barriers we've got at the moment is the infrastructure and the supply chain. And those are the two pieces where we need that a carbon price might support, but I don't think it will have a dramatic impact. Those are long lead time items, essentially, in both cases, that where we need There needs to be government support to make sure those happens through the regulation and the way those markets are regulated, particularly the networks markets. And then supply chain needs to be thought through exactly, because at the moment what you've got, particularly with offshore wind, is you've got larger and larger turbines. So at some point they've got to stop and actually start producing them at scale. And that is one of the biggest challenges for the industry at the moment, because it's still going through such a massive supply chain change. So I think for me, those are bigger issues than potentially the actual commercialisation of it.
I tend to agree. If I could just add to that, I agree, Julia. I think it's mainly about the non-financial barriers at the moment. We see huge appetite from investors every day wanting to invest in green energy, but it's not often it's not the financial barriers so much as the non-financial ones that Juliet's referenced. And I suppose we had a huge price shock in 2021. I look at the data for 22, and you see Europe's primary energy demand going down by 3.5%. I suppose I'd describe that as relatively inelastic, in terms of the demand response. So I think price alone won't do it. We'll need to tackle those other barriers.
If I could just add, I think what we also saw was the consequences of not having a global carbon price if you're going to have one. So as all that gas got sucked into Europe, where the gas would have gone otherwise, saw coal pick up. You saw that in China and India, Indonesia, where coal all ramped up fairly dramatically, and effectively Europe exported its carbon problem elsewhere as those shifts took place.
I think everything that's been said was fully agree with. I think the only add would be, I think there is a role for carbon pricing and a shift in carbon pricing. I think last year was a little unusual to say, because of the nature of the response and the acuteness of the response. I think the behaviours against security are very different to the behaviours around optimisation of cases. So I think as we go forwards and we hopefully we rebalance those objectives, and a carbon price can help that switching, and 82% still being a very stubborn number, I think we need all levers being put into play.
Thank you. The gentleman over here.
Good afternoon. Simon McCallum, Chief Executive at Elexon. We manage the balancing and settlement of the electricity wholesale market in the UK. We've heard a lot in that report about consumption, and thank you, Juliet and Nick, for some excellent data. I wondered if the panel would give us their thoughts on the intervention of both government and the industry as a whole on smarter use of energy, whether that's for reduction or whether that's for peak management or whether that's a move towards net zero.
You go ahead, Julia.
I can start to try and answer that question. I mean, I think so from what I understand, your question is really about, so you've got energy efficiency, which is the total demand reduction, but you've also then got smarter use, which is where you actually get a demand response that responds to when your power peaks are, or where you've actually got potential power production excess, like sort of wind power, particularly in the winter times. So one of the challenges with that, again, comes back to infrastructure, as I'm sure you're well aware, is that the smart meter rollout in the UK, but also you've seen some countries where smart metering is rolled out better, so dynamic demand can be better responded to, but the UK particularly is behind the curve on that. And then I think one of the things we haven't begun to see yet is the innovation in households are still, when you go into a house, you don't walk in, it doesn't start controlling itself. We haven't seen this concept of homes as power stations take over. And that is still something on the innovation. So and for me, that's a mixture. I think there's lots of innovations out there that are trying to get into that and trying to be that, but there's no clear regulation that allows for it to happen at scale. So we've seen lots of tinkering and lots of great little pieces of technology, but nothing coming together at scale that can really start to deliver and support the balancing of energy, power systems particularly.
Did you want to add to that?
I would just add to that, and I think you can take most geographies which are trying to make a transition, or particularly geographies which have a high growth, and they're having to make the decision as to what grid infrastructure do I put in. What storage solutions do I put in? How do I think about renewables? Is it edge of grid? And I think there's a huge connectivity question, which, we're only just starting to grapple with. To Juliet's point, you can do that on a domestic level, you can do that on a scale level. I think the way that we use data, digital, and some of the optimization around that, and particularly in a world where we've all just been through the experience of generative AI and all the wonderful things which are coming down the road with that, but that connectivity, I think we are just starting to see play, and I'm not sure all governments have really understood the importance of that to both more effectively use the assets we have, more effectively deploy capital to the assets we need, and make the connectivity easier with regulation and policy. But I think that data and software infrastructure is pretty vital in any geography that you're looking to develop.
Just going to take a couple of questions from our online viewers. How can we persuade the oil and gas companies, this is an anonymous question, by the way, there's a reason I didn't do an introduction. How can we persuade the oil and gas companies to go wholeheartedly for the transition rather than maximising short-term returns? Well, I think that's back to the point about why are oil and gas and coal so sticky? Why aren't we seeing a faster move? And why are the financial incentives seemingly in the place where they're drawing money into fossil fuels still, rather than renewables?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is about this long-term business model. What does the long-term business model of organisations look like? And they're very different. So you're going from oil and gas exploration to renewables, which are very different margin plays. And so that transition from one business model to another really has to be thought through and to a point planned. You can't just expect markets. I mean, my personal experience of energy markets particularly and regulation, it's quite good at small change control, so moving small amounts. You want to get it to shift to big shifts, then you have to have big decisions and you have to have structures that shift, because otherwise people keep tinkering and they keep going backwards. I think there have been some oil and gas companies that have made big transitions. Ørsted, which used to be Dong, has gone from being an oil and gas business to an offshore wind business.
Although they did that with the government having a major stake, which
of course,
I think did make a big difference to their ability to move.
But it's not. But the point is that there is with all of these things, having a transition map is the point. Is understanding how to do it and how it transitions from today, because it's very difficult making those decisions that we're going to give something up, and that's what essentially we're asking people to do.
I also think the focus tends to be a supply push. And that's been the narrative through 2022, that the world needs more of all of these forms of energy, and we focus on the supply push. And there's massive hypocrisies in all of this. On the one hand, development banks being driven to push to not invest in oil and gas in Africa, and then the second the taps get turned off from Russia, Europe calling on African countries to export its gas resources to Europe to fill the gap. But I think if we are to deliver this transition, we have got to understand the consumer side. And this is not to create an excuse for any organisation, but we need to understand how consumers are going to, every consumer, I don't mean just individuals, I mean businesses, how those consumption patterns need to change to deliver this change. And I think, I gave that example of an internal combustion engine versus an electric vehicle. There are many other examples. Heat pumps is a prime one, where if we start mapping the world backwards from what am I actually trying to achieve in terms of moving something, lighting something, heating something, and work back from there, what do I actually need to make that happen? And I think that's a fundamental shift that we need to have in a mindset around this industry.
I'd agree with that. Just to add the additional point about corporate reporting and transparency, very, very important, and credit actually to UK's led the way on this in terms of climate risk reporting, climate transition plans. That gives investors that clarity about the company strategy and whether it actually all adds up. I think that's got a role to play here as well.
Yeah. Do you want to add anything, Richard, or have they covered it comprehensively?
I think maybe just specifically on the oil and gas, I think that I think like any other major industry, there's a lot of capability, skills, global presence, and ability to get things done. And I think, given everything we've talked about what we saw last year, where we're going, there is a need for those organisations to continue to lean in and make their skills really have impact on this transition, and it is a transition, to Juliette's point. As to the pace of change, the speed of change, which companies do, I mean, leave that with the companies and the choices, and others to comment on. But I think leaning in is the most critical thing, because those skills and capabilities are making differences.
Thank you. A question from Courtney DePala. What are the top 3 things that regulators can do in the next year? This is a forward-looking question, I'm sorry, panel. To help accelerate and support the energy transition. So if we flip that around, what didn't governments do last year that could have accelerated the transition?
Well, long-term frameworks is the thing I would always say is the top issue for regulators, to give that clarity for investors. And where we've got those clear long-term regulatory signals, you take the ban on petrol and diesel car sales in the UK, that then can stimulate supply chains to respond accordingly. Where we don't have it, you just don't see that clarity, and so you don't see the movement in terms of the industry and the jobs benefit, which is so important in terms of getting the economic growth story around the new energies that we're moving to. So I think that would be the first one on my list.
I think the power regulators, looking at the infrastructure requirements for this transition and actually doing a strategic plan. Quite often, power regulators tend to respond to markets and what the demand on that market is. So if you want a wind turbine, then apply for one, and then we'll build it to do that. Actually, I think we need to be much more strategic about that if we want to move at pace. So I think power regulators should have a strategic plan where they figure out where these resources are going to be needed and actually build to ahead of the market rather than wait for the market to demand.
And if I could add a third, I think it's got to be about the future skills and the workforce. Today around the world there are about 65 million people that work in energy. We're going to need a lot more people working in energy, as well as recognising that a lot of people that work in one part of energy today need help transitioning to a different part of energy tomorrow. And you just look at the scale of things like deployment of heat pumps and EV chargers in the UK alone. We do not have the people. We have an industry that does not demographically represent the societies in which we operate, and so attracting far more women into energy, attracting all forms of diversity into energy is going to be absolutely critical. It's something that we're very passionate about at the Energy Institute through our work with Powerful Women and other initiatives, really trying to change the sort of face of the future energy workforce. So government doesn't have a role in necessarily sort of micromanaging that, but creating the mechanisms, the support, and really pushing that is going to be critical.
This has come up. Oh, we've got a question at the back here, please, before I make my comments. Go on.
Hello, my name's Nina Skrutzker. I'm the Chief Executive of the Association for Renewable Energy and Clean Technology. And thank you for the launch of this report. After the questions I carried through my own head around the data, obviously as a scientist, I'm going, where has all this data come from? I put it to one side. But the shocking number is the 82% still reliance on fossil fuel across the world. But if we flip that on the head, then I'm agreeing with Nick here. There's got to be this clarion call here that there's so much more yet to be done, and what an exciting career it can be to move into this. But my question is to the panel is, what do we think that the governments have got wrong in 2022 and need to put right? You asked the question in a particular way. I mean, I'd love to put a finger on the UK government in some of the mixed signals that they've given in this last year. What do they have to do, and what would you be hoping to hear them say at COP28 later on this year?
You've stolen one of my questions. I think Juliette was addressing this earlier about that difference between short-term and long-term thinking, and it was quite a short-term reaction, but maybe the panel can respond.
We've talked about it several times today, and nice to see you, Nina. I think, energy efficiency, we lost a decade. In this country, we could have made far more meaningful changes. got the sense that there was sort of a feeling that it's sort of nanny state to, encourage people to insulate their homes. It's not nanny state, it's common sense. There are lots of things governments around the world encourage us or regulate or mandate us to do. And I think providing, simple, clear guidance, which is something we try and do as an organisation, providing simple, clear mechanisms to allow the right people to get the financial help would make a real difference. I also think where there are the interventions in markets, you've got to make sure there aren't unintended consequences. I'm not arguing that there shouldn't have been a price cap, but when a price cap is affected, the people that benefited the most from that were the wealthiest who consume the most energy. People with multiple homes, people with multiple cars, those are the people that benefit most in absolute terms from those sorts of measures. So I would hope in future where we find ourselves in a situation, we'd have far more targeted measures that allow the price mechanism to impact the demand of energy whilst protecting the most vulnerable. And it's not to be critical because the pace in which these things were enacted was incredible, but there are some lessons I think we can draw from that.
Maybe on the COP28 part of that question. So obviously COP27 came and went, and I think COP28 actually is a bit more meaningful because of the stocktake that's going to happen, and we're really going to get real information, real data on where are we progressing, where are we not progressing, how big a gap. And a hypothesis, but I think it's probably from everything we've said, we are going to be off by some significant margin when it comes to COP28, but it will be very grounded. It'll be interesting to see how the precursor meetings to that take place and anything that comes out of that directionally. I would hope that at that point that, we need concrete measures and commitments, which we probably haven't seen at 27. We may have seen some of it at 26, but if you look at the actual action post 26 on some of those measures and commitments, it sort of fell away. And you could say in 22 there's reasons for it falling away. But I think in 28, if we are to return and get really back on course, I think that's the moment, because it will be a debate we can't avoid because the facts will be on the table. A little bit like the facts we try and put on the table. Hopefully that will be the case at 28. And we'll have some firmer commitments.
And for me, the critical aspect is there's been a lot of debate around whether it's appropriate to be holding COP28 in a petrostate. My personal view on this is if you exclude 82% of the problem, you're never going to fix it. And so I think having real leadership from the fossil fuel industry is going to be critical. I think one of the things I touched on briefly was the focus on fugitive methane emissions and flaring. And this is a real opportunity for some real leadership coming out of COP28, where actually many of the sort of companies and organisations represented there are actually leading in this space, and the ability to sort of take on the lessons of how you mitigate fugitive emissions, flaring, and get that to other. We've seen some of the huge issues in Turkmenistan through the course of the last few months. Actually get that leadership across the entirety of the sector can make a real difference. And actually tackling these emissions is probably the single biggest thing we can do between now and 2030. And yet on a list of what really matters, it's normally not even on the list, let alone in the top 3.
Simon, did you have any thoughts?
Just to add, I very much agree with all those comments. But Nina, you've probably heard me say before, I also think there was a missed opportunity to think about the institutions we need to do the long-term system thinking. If you look at this data and the complexity that we're juggling with in terms of the world energy system, that's true of every country. And are we set up right, both here and around the world, to do that long-term system thinking that's now needed if we're going to lead the way on the energy transition?
And
Julia.
just to add to that, I would agree with Simon on the long-term system thinking. I also think if we were going to make one call on governments at COP28, is that they look at their own procurement practices. So government procurement is a massive part of energy use in every single country. And if every government actually committed that their personal procurement was going to shift to zero carbon, that would make a huge shift. It would also push supply chains significantly. And it would show significant leadership. And I think that's one of those hidden things that governments don't really get to grapple. So clear up their own home first, and that's what they should be bringing to COP28.
Thank you. I think there was a question over here. Yes.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth de Jong from the United Kingdom Petroleum Industries Association. We were looking a little earlier about what oil and gas, I can't speak for gas companies, need in order to invest, and I can add a little to that debate. But really thinking about what they need to invest in the United Kingdom, and we're part of a global competitive marketplace, and the United Kingdom is looking to be a really hard place to invest. And refineries have such an important part to play in their own decarbonisation, but also that of industrial clusters. Our carbon prices are the highest. That makes business cases hard. Our electricity and gas also, when you're comparing to the United States or the EU as well. So there's things to look at there, particularly for our carbon pricing for investments in the energy transition as well, but also the speed at which we're able to progress here, our hydrogen business cases for investment with government, and also our carbon capture business cases with government as well, because the lack of resource there means that we're really slow, and we need every available source of undersea storage to be used for carbon in order to be able to decarbonise our big industries and not lose them abroad. It's great in terms of our net zero carbon accounting, just closing down UK manufacturing, but if you want to have energy security and many of the skills that are the green jobs now and in the future, we really need to look at how we attract investment here in our competitive marketplace.
Is that a question? Is there a question?
No, I was adding
Just
to
a
the
comment,
debate
okay.
earlier because I couldn't be seen here with my hand up for that.
This gentleman just here. Yeah.
I'm Hamish Lozelle from Octopus Energy. I was pleased that there were a few optimistic notes in there, as well as the kind of headline stickiness of fossil fuels. But one of which obviously being that the cost of renewables is lower in most regions in the world than fossil fuels. The other, that the efficiency of an electric vehicle is 3 times that of a petrol one in terms of distance you could travel. Clearly a key theme in the energy transition is electrification. There's a second part, which is where that electricity is coming from, but I wondered whether in the report we were seeing anything on electrification in terms of heating or electrification in terms of transport that were further nuggets of optimism as we approach the energy transition.
Can I give that to Nick?
I think, Hamish, the reality is we don't currently pull out the data to such a degree that it allows us to sort of differentiate the electrons that have gone into an EV versus anything else. I think where others have looked at this, and I know the IEA did some numbers last year, I think they came up with a number of around 50 terawatt hours for all the charging for EVs in that given year. So at the moment, it's sort of rounding errors in terms of how much is going into different places. That will clearly dramatically shift as we go forward on this, and is hopefully something we can think about how we can evolve the product to give us more insights as to where the electrons are actually going to, and therefore, how you could use that to believe what it would take to actually, accelerate the transition in some areas.
And I think this is, Nick and I have been debating the calculation of primary energy, because obviously renewables there's a factor that changes the output from renewables into a primary energy number, and how that is reflected in either heat or transport, electricity for transport, will have a big impact. So it's one of the things I think that we'll be keeping an eye on and figuring out how we manage that going forwards.
Can I take a question from the gentleman here?
Thanks, Sarah. So Dave Ernsberger from Platts, part of S&P Global Commodity Insights. Congratulations to the Institute for taking over the report, especially with such a short lead time, and it's good data as always. My question is really about carbon again. I know we've talked a few times about carbon, but my sense is that a lot of time when we talked about the carbon price and the question at the start of the session here, the focus has been largely on the compliance carbon market and the compliance carbon market price. So to go in a slightly different direction with carbon, what effect do you think the voluntary carbon markets can have on this picture? There's a philosophy that the voluntary carbon markets, hand in hand with the compliance markets, can help incentivize carbon accounting, carbon reduction, carbon removal, and so on. I mean, in the view of the Institute, the view of the panel, is there a role for voluntary carbon markets in solving this riddle? Something I'm curious to hear you talk about.
I wonder if, Simon, you were mentioning earlier the new reporting requirements that are coming in. And I think carbon is quite relevant there because voluntary carbon is not in the draft reporting requirements as something that will be recognised by EU regulation on the carbon balance sheet. I mean, how is that affecting how companies are viewing it?
It is,
voluntary carbon
it is, and the rules obviously will determine the behaviours. So, well, I think there is a role for voluntary carbon markets to play alongside other carbon markets that already exist, like the EU ETS and so on. I think we need to see the regulatory framework standardise and make sure that we don't have greenwashing in there in terms of the carbon removals that are being committed to. So, yes, I think there is a role for voluntary carbon markets over time. But it all hinges now about how the regulatory framework evolves, and do we have that confidence in the emissions that are actually being removed?
And in addition to that, what I think is quite interesting about those voluntary carbon markets is they bring other social impact as well. So quite often when you see those coming through, you have a wider social impact. And if we come back to the kind of concept of the just transition, that is going to be so important about the speed that we can go. Because if this comes across as an unjust transition, then there will be massive resistance to it from governments all over the world. So it has to be just. And for me, that's where I see the voluntary markets playing a bigger role in that part.
They're a big flow of capital from the global north to the global south.
Exactly.
I think we had another question. Yes.
Luke Herbert, Executive Director for Communications at Climate Group. I'm just wondering if the panel or those producing the report had seen an indication of the scale of the kind of waiting list that we have for renewables and clean energy. This is not coming through to the market yet because of the issues around infrastructure regulation and so on that you've highlighted already. You know, is that of the scale that would, if that had been unlocked or is going to be unlocked quicker, that we would see a different sort of macro result coming from this, or is that still, you know, really in the decimal points in terms of what's been held back at the moment? And also, I think, you know, we at Climate Group, we see similar issues in terms of supply chain regulation, infrastructure, slowing this down. We see companies in Western Europe, US, who want to do power purchase agreements, get those through quicker, you know, if they're having to wait. And we see in places like South Korea where the government has upped its nuclear target and reduced its renewables target by the same amount, you know, which is just really, really backwards against where other markets are going. But it's a lot of noodling that needs to be done to move these things forward. It's about doing your job better, driving the infrastructure better, you know, getting into the details of regulation. And how do we frame that in the global point of view when we come to COP28? How do we kind of build that in a macro agenda that we can get around and understand what those moves are that need to happen across the world, rather than lots of the individual policy details per country? That's great, but it's hard to campaign on.
I think Simon and Richard might have something to say on this, starting with Simon.
So just on your first point about are we seeing it in the data? No, not yet in terms of the constraints from the non-financial barriers. I think you'd have to say with the kind of increases we saw, you know, 19% China year-on-year growth, India 19, Middle East 20, US 16, you'd probably say there's not an obvious effect there yet. It may come through, because remember that the projects that we're talking about were generating last year would have been started many, many years ago. And I think we have to just think about the lead time. I think those of us in the sector all know these supply chain constraints are real, but that may not show for a while yet. And just a quick plug, we are at KPMG doing a big report on the barriers to faster renewables deployment that'll be out at COP28. So I'll get that in while I can in response to your final point.
Heard it here first.
I'm looking forward to it.
Richard, you mentioned the US regulation and how that might actually change the picture quite a bit going forward but maybe there's a few other examples too.
Well, maybe, and I just want to respond to the question. I think there is I think you're putting your finger on a really important point. There is an enormous pipeline. Some of that pipeline has physical constraints on supply chain pace, but some of it is driven by government's ability to actually make this happen, and that does vary between the various geographies. I think, the fact we're waiting for, 10, 12 years sometimes to actually get grid connection, I mean, the next 10 years is the 10 years we have to make a difference. If this is the blocker, then this is something that we really need to address.
Completely.
And I think when we get that proper foundation at COP28, I do hope that we do see governments actually really change the mode and the way in which we tackle things which are nothing to do with the technology. It's available, the supply chains and the way that we deploy, but really address those. Back to the US question, I mean, of course, the US has, the amount of money that's been put there, the scale of the market, the nature of the grid, the state system that they had and the variations of that. I mean, there's just a lot of expectation now that you're going to see a lot more initiatives, projects go forwards. Whether they will be met with a faster pace in terms of how they deal with some of the planning and permitting elements associated with those, we'll have to see, but I assume so. I mean, outside of that, the EU response is quite both EU but also country specific. I mean, here back in the UK, I think as an island, we have interconnectors. The level of interconnectors have gone up dramatically, so we are going to be trading, and we saw that as a very positive thing last year, both gas molecules and power molecules into Europe from the UK. But as an island, you need a system that sort of connects all of that together. And thinking about the build-out of offshore wind, think about the transmission infrastructure required to bring that into the south as well. There's just a lot to put together. And at the pace of change we're going, we need to some extent to shift gears on that. And I would hope, to the point that was made earlier, given the scale of investments being made, Europe, China, US, we also need to make sort of significant investments here if we're going to be part of building that out, but also having the businesses which can export that skill set elsewhere as well.
And I think it's quite interesting because what we're seeing at the moment, the era in the US is being seen as a competitive tension amongst sort of for investment and for industry to move to. I mean, the reality is that we're only going to make this at COP28. It's only going to really work if we get collaboration and cooperation between countries and using examples of where we've got great policies and things have moved really fast and supporting other countries to do the same. So I think although ERA is a great kind of move forwards, I would like to see it kind of make sure that it's not just the US trying to say we're going to grab it all and we don't care about the rest of the world. I think we need to see that collaboration and cooperation across countries.
Or if it does turn into a competition, that everyone builds on everyone else's regulation and everything does accelerate as a result, I guess. Yeah. Nick, did you want to add anything?
No, I think it's been well covered by the fellow panellists.
Good. Back to the room. Can this gentleman have a microphone, please?
Hi there, Mark Williams, Energy UK. We heard earlier around how effectively, although at extreme cost, price signals and the market mechanism helped us deal with the change in the gas market last year. And we've also heard how renewables are now cheaper in many settings than fossil fuels. What lessons can we learn from the sort of brutal market forces of last year around that longer-term transition and how important price signals are and how important more intervention might be?
Nick?
So I think nobody wants to go through what happened last year, except probably some of the trading houses that did very well from it. But I think outside of that, it reinforced the need, as Simon and others have talked about today, about the need for long-term planning. I think the need for systems thinking in terms of how we think about this, because yes, on a per kilowatt hour basis, renewables are cheaper, but as many will say, but that's only when the wind blows and the sun shines. And so how do you think about this integrated system where storage and other things will play a role, but also for a very long time there is an inevitability that gas will provide a big chunk of that balancing. How do you price gas into that? Logically, it probably isn't on a per kilowatt hour basis if you're paying for gas to only be on 1-2 weeks a year or whatever it is. So I think there's a far more integrated systems approach that we need to think about. And then I think there's a huge aspect of how consumers engage in this. We talked a little bit about the role of smart technologies and the ability to use price signals. And of course, the reality is it's, as always, it tends to be those who are wealthiest, those with Teslas sitting on their front driveways, who can access the lowest cost energy because they price when energy is at zero or negative in some instances. And so we need something that helps everybody get access to the benefits of shifting demand and using technology to optimize their households, their cars, and of course businesses as well. So I think there's that whole systems thinking that is absolutely critical.
I think it's also interesting that I think we have to be careful where we see excessive profitability coming through from issues like this, that governments don't step in. Because at some point there's regulation. So obviously, as we move to this marketplace where potentially gas is still the price setter, particularly here in the UK, but other countries, if there are margins where people can make huge amounts of money, governments are going to do something at some point. So there needs to be a discussion between the industry and the regulators about how we manage that transition through and what these new markets in transition look like. Because I've been through a CMA review. It wasn't fun, and it didn't get a great outcome. I think industry working well with governments is a much better approach to these kind of things.
Simon?
Yeah, I mean, we should be using even sharper price signals in the future. Hopefully dealt with where consumers don't have to worry about it, and it's all done for them by clever technology. I mean, that's of course where we should all be going. I'm sure we'd all agree with that. But we've also come back to the point about systems thinking. We're going to have a lot of excess renewable generation, aren't we? So how are we going to use that? What vectors are we going to use? Is that going to be hydrogen? Is it going to be something else? We've got to think in that system way if we're going to make most use in this smarter energy system. I think we want to see in every economy around the world.
Just going to take another online question from Andy Gray. Fossil to renewable transition doesn't seem to be aligned with infrastructure reinforcement. New development is already being limited. How is this being addressed? So are you seeing governments shift to try and, the pipeline that we were talking about earlier, try and unblock the pipeline? I
think there has been. If I'll probably go slightly off pitch, but my personal view is that what I think we've seen, sorry, I've just been upsetting my mic. What we've been seeing is a challenge between the political reality of trying to expand infrastructure, particularly power infrastructure, in politically in areas where it's seen as politically unacceptable. So we haven't had, I know the UK probably more in detail, but we haven't had decisions made on big infrastructure investment requirements over the last 10, 15 years. And that has been an ongoing issue. We are now suddenly deciding that we're going to have to allow a lot of this investment to go ahead. So a lot of the licenses have been pushed through. But we're still going to have this situation where we're going to have to put a lot of power lines in people's backyards. And that is something that we're going to have to manage as an industry in terms of explaining to people why is this power infrastructure so important? What does it deliver to the countries where this power infrastructure is going to have? And actually, one good thing I have seen is that we have looked at redesigning these things so they're not quite as ugly as they used to be. And I know that sounds like a really stupid, but making things acceptable to the end user, we ignore that at our peril. The consumer will have an impact in the long term, and making them more acceptable is really important.
Richard?
My only add to that is just maybe, I think there's developed world, there's developing world, and obviously developed world, we need to decarbonise and do all the things. I think the developing world as well, in terms of, if we just think about, this doubling of the power requirements between now and 2050, it's going to come from geographies which are going to have to grow out their infrastructure, grow out their generation, grow out their end use technologies. I think that's a great opportunity. But in some of those geographies, the cost of capital is also punitive. And, you only have to go to sub-Saharan Africa where we do need more power. But actually, even though Namibia has 7 times the natural resource falling on it than Italy, it's still more economic to put a wind farm or a solar system, should I say, in Italy than it is in Namibia. So until we resolve some of that, I think we are underestimating the level of change that we need on those areas where there are still populations that need clean power. There are populations which are moving to middle class, which are looking for that aspirational change and that higher use of energy. And I think it's those geographies as well that, when we think about that, infrastructure play is going to be pretty important.
I mean, the follow-on question is, we have an anonymous question from online, which is, well, how do we unlock that finance in the developing world? And I think that this gets to the point that Juliette made earlier about how Africa has been very disappointing in terms of the amount of the renewables being deployed there.
I mean, maybe just to follow on immediately on Africa then, if you take the Africa scenario, I mean, capital and return on capital follows risk. So it's perceived risk and real risk. The perceived risk in Africa is obviously there's different country situations. In Africa is 50 countries, all with very different starting points and also different infrastructure. I would say one of the most significant things there is the off-taker risk associated with some of those projects and the reliability of that. If we can tackle that and help those nations tackle that, then you bring the risk down and then you start to potentially get a better cost of capital for those.
Interesting. One of the first pieces of work I ever worked on was something called the European Energy Charter, which was about securing up investment into Central and Eastern Europe and Russia to bring gas and oil pipelines into Europe. So slightly ironic right now. What's interesting about that treaty was it was all about giving security to investment going into those countries. And my question is, because it's also seen as a blocker to development, to transition to energy transition today, actually taking something like that institution and redeveloping it so you could actually get countries around the table negotiating a treaty where basically investment into those countries was protected. And there was a mechanism for people to invest that would make a massive difference. Because I've looked at investment into Africa. It's almost impossible to do because of the political risk. And that's your biggest issue. However, everything else stacks up brilliantly.
Can we have a question from the gentleman at the back, please?
2 microphones, if possible. Mike Tolan from Offshore Energies UK. Been a lot of discussion about electrons. I'm interested in molecules as well. So any thoughts on hydrogen, both from what you're seeing currently or where it's going, blue, green, whatever the colour? What do you see the role of hydrogen being, and what will that signal about emerging markets? Because we've got to both change demand as well as change supply in the world to come.
I'll hand that to Richard to start with, I think.
Yeah, great question. I mean, on the hydrogen side, obviously we're at a very nascent start. There is little demand, little infrastructure and little supply at the moment, but a lot of opportunity. I think the first thing that we would say from our observations is there are some very specific use cases for hydrogen that make sense, and there are many other cases being put out which have, questionable end games. But on those which make sense, I would say some of the natural resource price, because green hydrogen is 70%, 8% the electron cost effectively. So you need, first of all, high renewables. Some of these things we're seeing in developing markets like India, as well as then in places like Australia and others, have the economics to bring on green hydrogen and actually play a real role. What role they play then becomes quite important. It's very clear it's always going to be a high price relative to some of the solutions. So in the most difficult to abate areas, aviation and marine, potentially that's where hydrogen plays a role. And hydrogen as a storage potentially plays a role here in other geographies as well for different reasons. Blue and green, our analysis at the Energy Transition Institute, we would say that the blue potentially with green to start off, but ultimately green hydrogen, once you get down to the economics and the infrastructure, is probably the most dominant of that. And we've looked at all the different economics around the various vectors in terms of moving hydrogen molecules around. But it's certainly going to play a role. The challenge with hydrogen is it's some way off. I don't think we're going to be seeing that in the reports here at materiality for some time yet. But if we don't start, and we don't start to move on that, we won't see it either. But I think we've got to be very clear on the use cases that we deploy capital towards.
Do you want to add anything, Sam?
Yeah, I mean, we're already seeing the impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies, Mike, in terms of activities in the States on hydrogen. Also, a lot of interest from Middle East clients in terms of their plans going forward. So there is huge amounts of interest. But I agree with Richard. In terms of this survey, it won't show in the data for some time to come. And we're of the same view. It's blue and then green, and green will build up over time as we utilise that excess renewable generation.
And it's also very regional in terms of thinking through it. So I think the UK constrains off about 7% of its total wind output. Thinking about where that is constrained and how that interacts with some of the discussion we've been having about particularly the power network infrastructure and where the constraints are on that. That, for me, is what's really interesting about hydrogen, is what role it can play to unplug some of the issues related to the infrastructure challenges that we see today in the power sector.
And I agree with all those comments. I think the one thing I would add is there is 94 million tonnes a year produced of hydrogen, which is grey and black today, that's used in fertiliser production, refineries, and I think the share of green and blue or green hydrogen is a fraction of 1%. So one of the things there's a lot of focus on all the wonderful things you might be able to do with hydrogen. I think priority number one needs to be, how do we decarbonise those 94 million tonnes a year of black, grey hydrogen that's produced from coal or gas, because that is the sort of critical focus if we're actually serious about addressing climate change. And then I think there's a question of the regional point that Juliette alluded to. There's a lot of debate at the moment around the notion of hydrogen sort of effectively becoming LNG. My slight challenge to that thesis is actually, I think industry needs to move where the abundant resources are. And so the notion that hydrogen is going to be shipped from Africa to industrialised economies rather than industry is going to move to Africa, I think is something that will be debated and evolve over the coming decades, but one to watch out for.
Thanks, Nick. We have time for one last question, if there is another question in the room. Oh, there is.
It's probably almost impossible questions to answer, so good last one. I'm Will Steggles from the Crown Estate, which Juliette introed earlier. It's really about whether there's any evidence on sort of, if you like, free market economies versus planned economies or more centralised economies in terms of how they've managed to transition. Because a lot of you rightly talked about the need for more strategic central planning, for want of a better word. And I can see that's really necessary in terms of the energy system, in terms of making sure you've got grid ahead of need and so on. But then equally, I wonder whether some of the more free market economies, which are more market-led, have been more responsive to things like renewables becoming cheap or gas becoming expensive, those kind of things. So any kind of observations from people on what types of economies have done better at transitioning? And you can just duck the question if you want to.
It's an interesting question. I think China's a good place to start, potentially. And I think Richard and Simon made comments about it to me earlier, so I know they have views. But I think everyone probably does.
Yeah.
Do you want to kick off, Richard?
You can start, though.
I'm happy to start. Thank you very much for the question. I think it's a great last question to end on. What's the right what's the right political situation to move forwards fast? I think that not to really dodge the question, but I think the question is not easily answered, because if you take the politics of a country or the governance of a country, it's only one dimension of how you see any of this transition happen. I talked about Brazil as being, it's naturally blessed. Some of these places are just naturally blessed. If you talk about, the transition in Germany, the infrastructure in Germany that's being built up, it's very different if I go to some other geographies. So I don't think you can pull out one dimension as a this, therefore this. But I would say if we just went back to a simple example of the planning process for some of this renewable deployment, if you looked at how many years does it take, I think if you went to China, it's a lot faster. And I'll probably just leave it at that.
Yeah. Simon?
So I'm going to suggest that the hypothesis in which the question is founded is wrong, in the sense that it's not a dichotomy between more market or more state. I actually think you need as much market and innovation from all the wonderful companies that are represented in this room and elsewhere to develop the new technologies, deploy the new products, and you need greater strategic planning for the things the market can't deliver on its own. So I would say you need more market and more innovation and more strategic planning, and that would be the combination. And I think we often hear this debate polarised as we should just go back to a free market or we need more state planning. It's actually you need both, in my view.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I kind of think about this in kind of 5 key areas: innovation, infrastructure, money, consumers, people as consumers, and skills. And I think you need a combination, as Simon says, of each of those in different parts. So I think innovation is actually a mixture of government and industry. Long-term innovation funding in the UK has been predominantly into aerospace and automotive over the last 20 years, not into climate and energy. So that makes a big difference, which is why hydrogen, I think, is so far behind. Infrastructure is a government. I mean, infrastructures are monopolies generally in most countries. So you've got to have government regulation. Money is a marketplace, and my view is money goes where it's most efficient generally, within a structure as well. People and consumerism can move things fast, particularly if you make it attractive. Part of the reason why the EV pickup is because EVs are great to drive. I mean, they are fantastic. And then skills and education, how you put that, I think that's then long-term investment from a country in terms of how they think about their skills and innovation. So I think it's a real combination across, it's sort of more multi-dimensional than just the energy sector.
Yeah, I fully agree with all of that. I think it comes back again to this point around systems thinking, whole systems thinking. It comes down to the point on consumers and making this something that consumers want to engage in. And this industry is the least consumer-facing of any industry out there, I think, probably bar mining and weapons. I think every other industry has far more engagement with consumers. And we've seen entire industries just flipped on their heads because of the interaction with consumers. I also think there's a point of consistency, of governments not changing policy as elections come and go, but actually consistency. You look at onshore wind here in the UK, on, off. I mean, we just need clarity on that and to move on with it. And then I think there is a point around unintended consequences. And, without naming any country, what a year to be turning, or, the previous year to be turning off nuclear generation. So I think we need to think about the unintended consequences of some things being driven by what people think the electorate wants when actually it doesn't really play out as they might have hoped.
Thanks, Nick. And thank you all for such a great lot of questions this afternoon and making it a really interesting discussion. Thank you, Nick and Juliet and Simon and Richard, for all of your input. And now I'm going to hand over to Juliet, who's going to have some closing remarks.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, everybody. And what a fantastic panel. Thank you, Sarah. That was brilliant. So I'd just like to wrap up very quickly. And first of all, say thanks to BP. Spencer, you're here in the audience. Thank you so much for being here today and handing over the reins. I hope you think the EI has done it justice today and will continue to do it justice going forwards. And I hope we continue to have your support in that. Obviously, KPMG and to Carney, thank you so much for being partners on this. I think it makes a real difference, that depth of ability to think through what the stats are telling us and understand it. I think it came across in spades today on the panel. And obviously, thanks to Nick and the team at EI for all their work and for taking it on. I think there was always some concern we wouldn't be able to do it, but actually, I think you've done an amazing job. So thank you. Thanks to Harriet Watt for doing all the data, obviously the hard work and making sure that we got the information out. We got it out on time. And thanks to Sarah for today. I thought that was a brilliant panel. Fantastic. Really interesting. Just overall, this is a work in progress. I mean, from my point of view, the energy transition is not a go yet. There's not a green light. I think on a RAG status, you probably give it an amber to red right now. I think there's a lot of moving parts in here. What I'm quite excited about is this work can then start to input to really demonstrate what's going on. COP28 is a real opportunity for us to take this work and show it worldwide, and really hope to try and get some momentum behind the energy transition. So thank you all for being here today to welcome the Statistical Review to the Energy Institute, and thanks to everybody who was online and joined us, and thank you again for all your questions. Thank you. Those who aren't online, there are drinks in the library.